The UN Secretary General has described Gaza as a killing field, where civilians are in an endless death loop. Mr. President, we are here today because the General Assembly asked the Court to determine the legal obligations of Israel in relation to the provision of urgently needed humanitarian assistance by the United Nations, other international organizations, and third states, and in relation to the exercise of the right of Palestinian people to self-determination. This request was provoked by the international community's outrage at Israel's methodical targeting, banning, and obstructing of said parties, including its legislation banning the United Nations Relief and Works Agency of Palestine Refugees, UNRWA, from fulfilling its UN mandate in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. There can be no doubt about the Court's jurisdiction in these proceedings. The question raised by the General Assembly is plainly a legal one. It specifically asks the Court to advise on Israel's legal obligations under international law and other rules of international law. Nor is there any reason, let alone a compelling one, for the Court to decline to answer it, as the Court has already determined in 2 prior advisory opinions. The question of Palestine is fundamental to the United Nations and its mandate in this case. This request was provoked by the international communities. During this presentation, the State of Palestine will present evidence on the devastating immediate, intermediate, and long-term consequences of this unlawful Israeli policy on Palestine and its people, on every aspect of their fundamental rights and continued existence. The State of Palestine will also present the Court how Israel's prohibited conduct extends to the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, because the target of these actions, by admission of top Israeli leaders, is the permanent annexation of the Palestinian territory and the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. It is a self-incriminating admission that debunks the security sham they used to justify their genocide, as we will also demonstrate in our presentation. Mr. President, members of the Court, before I go any further, allow me to first address the context in which these deliberations are happening. This legal and moral crisis is not 18 months old. Israel has been systematically dispossessing, uprooting, slaughtering and imprisoning Palestinians in absolute flagrant disregard for international law and the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people for 80 years now. It has done so with the intent to destroy our people and to thwart the realization of self-determination in their homeland. To implement this policy, Israel has waged a relentless campaign of erasure against Palestinian people, their demography, their material presence, their national identity, their history and heritage, and their very humanity. This campaign of erasure was a central hallmark of the Nakba that started in 1947, and whose darkest chapter yet, unfolding before our eyes and yours. On 3 separate occasions in the past years, the Court issued provisional measures ordering Israel, among other things, to ensure and facilitate the unimpeded flow of humanitarian assistance into Gaza. Israel did not comply. On 19 July 2024, this Court also ruled that Israel's presence in and control over the occupied Palestinian territory is unlawful and must come to an end. The Court also ruled that despite the illegality of occupation regime, Israel was still bound by its obligations under international law as an occupying power. These obligations include ensuring the welfare of the protected civilians, Israel defied this ruling and the rule of law, brazenly declaring instead its official policy of annexing the occupied Palestinian territory, forcibly displacing Palestinian people, weaponizing food and humanitarian aid, and negating refugee issue and their rights, including by banning UNRWA. On 21st of November 2024, the ICC issued arrest warrants for the Prime Minister of Israel and now his former Minister of War, in part because they intentionally deprived civilian population in Gaza of food, water, medicine, and other essentials. To summarize, Israel is an unlawful occupying power, standing trial for genocide. Its Prime Minister is wanted by the ICC. It's attempting to destroy Palestinian people and erase Palestine, including by barring and obstructing humanitarian organizations, thus also violating its obligations under the UN Charter and other instruments of international law. That is the context of the question before you. Mr. President, members of the court, UNICEF says Israel's onslaught has killed and injured 100 Palestinian children in Gaza every day since 18 March 2025. This is in addition to the more than 15,000 children Israel has killed since the onset of genocide, and the thousands who are still missing under tons of piling rubble of what was once their schools and their homes. Israel's genocidal campaign has turned Gaza into the home of the largest cohort of child amputees per capita in the world. Their limbs are amputated without proper medicine or care, sometimes without so much as a painkiller. Many don't survive, like baby Sham Mharib, whose arm was amputated following a strike on her home 18 days ago. Israel's genocidal campaign has also targeted UN and other humanitarian workers and organizations in Gaza, killing over 408 UN workers, among them almost 300 UNRWA staff. They have also killed 27 Palestinian Red Crescent Society paramedics in Gaza and 113 civil defense first responders. These killings are deliberate, not accidental. This was proven repeatedly, including in January 2024, when Israeli soldiers killed 6-year-old Hind Rajab and her relatives, then murdered the Palestine Red Crescent paramedic who received permission to rescue Hind while she was still alive. It was proven once more last March when Israeli soldiers ambushed and killed 14 paramedics and humanitarian heroes. The soldiers then buried the bodies in a shallow mass grave alongside with their crushed ambulances and emergencies in an attempt to hide their crime, while top Israeli officials lied to the world about the murders. This is the jarring equation prompting our appeals to the court and these proceedings. Israel is starving, killing, and displacing Palestinians, while also targeting and blocking humanitarian organizations trying to save their lives. These grave crimes aim to hasten the forcible transfer and destruction of Palestinian people in the immediate term. They will also ensure that our children will suffer irreparable damage and harm, placing an entire generation at grave risk. Already experts have concluded that life expectancy in Gaza has been slashed in half since the onset of the genocide. Mr. President, members of the court, this targeting of life in the Gaza Strip has been ongoing for years and in grave violation of Israel's legal obligation as an occupying power and as a member of the UN. Israel began engineering food deprivation in Gaza 19 years ago, making the majority of civilian population dependent on food aid to survive. A senior Israeli official then said, and I quote, "The idea is to put the Palestinians on diet, but not to make them die of hunger," end quote. Since October 2023, the blockade has progressively turned into a total siege. The Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights said, "This siege is creating conditions that were incompatible with sustaining life or the continued existence of Palestinians in Gaza." These are the facts. Starvation is here. Humanitarian aid is being used as a weapon of war. All UN-supported bakeries in Gaza have been forced to shut their doors. 9 of every 10 Palestinians have no access to safe drinking water. Storage facilities of the UN and other international agencies are empty. More than 12,500 wounded Palestinians, including thousands of children, now require medical evacuation to have a chance at life. That is in addition to thousands of cancer and other patients dying slowly, dying in agony, and hundreds of thousands of children whose lives are in danger because Israel is denying entry of vaccines. Meanwhile, Israel continues to repeatedly, forcibly displace and starve the Palestinian population in Gaza. This UN-produced map illustrates how Israel has squeezed the population into a third of the Gaza Strip that it continues also to bomb. UNICEF, for example, has been forced to shut down 21 malnutrition clinics because of these repeated forced displacement orders. Israel has also waged a war on hospitals in Gaza, bombing them, laying siege to them, burning them, or leveling them to the ground. Israel has bombed and attacked all 36 hospitals in Gaza. The last hospital to be bombed was Gaza's Al-Ahli Baptist Hospital, an institution that has offered health to Palestinians since 1882. This hospital survived 2 world wars and many wars after, but Israel decommissioned it twice in the past 18 months. Israeli occupation forces have killed over 1,400 doctors, nurses, and other health workers. Some, like renowned surgeons Adnan al-Bursh and Iyad al-Rantisi, who were forcibly disappeared and tortured to death. Others, like director of Al-Awda Hospital, Dr. Ahmad Mhanna, was forcibly disappeared for over a year now, while director of Kamal Idwan Hospital, Hussam Abu Safiyi, continues to be unlawfully detained. Only a handful of hospitals continue to bravely function, thanks to the heroic Palestinian doctors who remain and the brave international doctors volunteering to assist them despite the dangers and severe Israeli restrictions. To understand what this means in real bone-chilling terms, I ask you here this brief testimony of Dr. Muhammad Mustafa, an Australian doctor who was volunteering in Gaza last March.
We've worked throughout the entire night. We haven't stopped. The bombing has been non-stop. We've run out of ketamine. We've run out of propofol. We've run out of all painkillers. We can't sedate anyone. We can't give them any analgesia. When we intubate people, they wake up and they're choking because we have no sedation. There are 7 girls getting their legs amputated, no anesthesia. The bombing is still going on. The room is still shaking. I haven't slept. We went to bed at about 1 o'clock, and at 1:30 the bombing started. It's about 10 a.m. now. I've just gone back to my room. I'm lightheaded. I'm dizzy, and I mean, it was just mostly women and children, burnt head to toe, limbs missing, heads missing. you know, there's a video I put up on my story of me doing a chest drain. The gentleman that did the chest drain, and he died on the way to the CT scan. There's another video of 3 girls laying on a bed. That's his 3 girls, who are now orphaned. Their mother didn't even make it into the hospital. She was killed along with their other sister. I don't know what to tell you. This is, I was here in June, nothing to this intensity. This is unbelievable, and the bombing is still going on. The rooms are still shaking. The screams are everywhere. It's insane.
Mr. President, members of the court, the carnage and destruction extends to the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. There, Israel's killing of Palestinian civilians, including children, was record-breaking for 3 years in a row before 2023. Since the beginning of the year, Israel launched a military assault in the West Bank, unprecedented since 1967. Israeli occupation have demolished, razed and burned the refugee camps in Jenin and Tulkarem, forcibly displacing more than 40,000 Palestinians. And Israel has announced that the displaced will not be allowed to return. The World Food Programme reports a near 100% increase in Palestinians in need of food aid in the West Bank. Impeding the presence and activities of the UN and international organizations must be viewed in the context of erasure and forced displacement. Mr. President, members of the court, before I stand before you today on behalf of the persecuted people, fighting to survive, to live freely in our land. This is our inalienable and most fundamental right. It is not anyone to give or withhold, as this court has repeatedly affirmed. That's really the heart of why Palestine and over 40 other states are addressing the court today. It is not about the number of aid trucks Israel is or is not allowing into the occupied Palestinian territory, especially Gaza. It is not about Israel destroying it is about Israel destroying the fundamentals of life in Palestine, while it blocks UN and other humanitarians from providing life-saving aid to the population. It is about Israel unraveling fundamental principles of international law, including their obligations under the UN Charter. It is about Israel turning Palestine, in particularly Gaza, into a mass grave for Palestinians and those coming to their aid. Before I conclude, Mr. President, allow me to describe the remainder of Palestine's presentation today. First, Mr. Paul Reichler will present Israel's legal obligations under international law and international humanitarian law. Next, Ms. Blinne Negroli will discuss Israel's violation of its legal obligations as a member of the United Nations. Then Professor R.D. Immunities will address legal obligations specifically in relation to UNRWA. He will be followed by Professor Alain Pillay, who will discuss the legal consequences of Israel's violations of its obligations with respect to the provision of humanitarian aid to the Palestinian civilian population and the exercise of their right to self-determination. Finally, Ambassador Riyad Mansour will present the State of Palestine's closing remarks. I thank you for your kind attention and ask that you call Mr. Reichler to the podium.
I thank Ambassador Hijazi. I now give the floor to Mr. Paul Reichler. Sir, you have the floor.
Mr. President, members of the court, it is, as always, an honor for me to appear before you, and it is a privilege to speak on behalf of the State of Palestine. And on behalf of all of my fellow counsel here as part of the delegation, we are pleased to echo the congratulations that were conveyed to you by our agent on your election as president. I will address Israel's legal obligations under international humanitarian law concerning the provision of humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian civilian population, and then Israel's legal obligations under the rules of international law set out in the Court's advisory opinion of 19 July 2024. I will conclude with some observations on Israel's legal obligations under overlapping rules of international humanitarian law and international criminal law. I begin with an update on the situation on the ground. On 1 March 2025, Israel announced that it would unilaterally end the 6-week ceasefire that had prevailed since mid-January, and that it would resume aerial bombardment and other armed attacks against Gaza. On the following day, 2 March, the office of the Prime Minister made this announcement. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has decided that as of this morning, the entry of all goods and supplies to the Gaza Strip will be halted. The Prime Minister's decision immediately cut off all humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian civilian population in Gaza. This was underscored by the head of Israel's civil administration for the occupied territory and Minister of Finance, Bezalel Smotrich, in another post on the same day. The decision we made last night to completely halt humanitarian aid to Gaza until Hamas is destroyed or completely surrenders and all our hostages are returned is an important step in the right direction, the threshold of the gates of hell. Now we need to open those gates as quickly and lethally as possible on the cruel enemy until absolute victory. Israel's Minister of Defense, Israel Katz, made clear that the cruel enemy was not just Hamas, but the entire civilian population of Gaza. He addressed this message specifically to them. Citizens of Gaza, this is your last warning. The Air Force attack against Hamas terrorists was only the first step. The rest will be significantly worse, and you will pay the price. Unless all the Israeli hostages are released and Hamas is expelled from Gaza, Israel will act with forces never before seen. The alternative is utter destruction and devastation. In keeping with these official Israeli statements, all humanitarian assistance intended for the civilian population of Gaza has been blocked by Israel since 2 March. No food, no water, no medicine, no fuel, no anything. For 57 days and still counting, Israel has prevented all goods and services of any kind from entering Gaza. On 9 March, Israel's energy minister, Eli Cohen, posted a picture of himself on the social media platform X, signing an order to cut off electricity to Gaza. The message accompanying the photo read, "I have now signed an order to cut off electricity to the Gaza Strip immediately. Enough with the talk. It's time for action." The impact of this action was to shut down the lone desalination plant in Gaza, depriving more than 600,000 Palestinians of their only access to water. Overall, the consequences for the Palestinian civilian population, especially the deprivation of urgently needed humanitarian assistance, have been as promised by Defense Minister Katz: utter destruction and devastation. According to the United Nations Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, who briefed the Security Council on 18 March, today I am distressed to report that in addition to the intense airstrikes that have resumed, since 2 March, Israeli authorities have cut off the entry of all life-saving supplies, food, medicines, fuel, cooking gas, for 2.1 million people. This total blockade of life-saving aid and basic commodities and commercial goods will have a disastrous impact on the people of Gaza, who remain dependent on a steady flow of assistance into the Strip. Blocking food, water, and medicine for people who need them is unconscionable. It also goes against international humanitarian law and the provisional orders of the International Court of Justice. Mr. President, members of the Court, the Undersecretary General is plainly right. The facts on which his statement is based are not in dispute. As you have seen, they're admitted, proudly and loudly proclaimed by Israel's most senior government officials. Nor can there be any dispute about the applicable law. In its July 2024 advisory opinion, the Court explained that international humanitarian law governs Israel's conduct in the OPT for as long as its occupation continues. Israel must thus comply with its obligations under the Fourth Geneva Convention, of which it is a state party, and Additional Protocol 1, the relevant articles of which are part of customary international law. The indisputable evidence shows that Israel has flagrantly violated these obligations. They include, first, the obligation under Article 55 of the Fourth Geneva Convention to ensure, to the fullest extent of the means available, provision of, quote, the food and medical supplies of the population. Under this article, Israel has an affirmative duty to, quote, bring in the necessary foodstuffs, medical stores, and other articles if the resources of the occupied territory are inadequate, which is undeniably the case throughout the Gaza Strip. Article 69 of Additional Protocol 1 further requires Israel to ensure the provision of, quote, clothing, bedding, means of shelter, and other supplies essential to the survival of the civilian population of the occupied territory. Second, Israel has the obligation under Article 56 of the Convention to ensure and maintain, to the fullest extent of the means available to it, quote, the medical and hospital establishments and services, public health and hygiene in the occupied territory. Article 56 further provides, quote, medical personnel of all categories shall be allowed to carry out their duties. Israel has been blatantly violating these obligations, and not only since 2 March, it has been violating them for many years, most egregiously since October 2023. On 9 October 2023, Israel announced a complete siege of the Gaza Strip, cutting off essential resources and the movement of goods, including food, water, medicines, fuel, and electricity. All crossing points between Israel and the Gaza Strip were sealed. Israel's defense minister at the time, Yoav Gallant, described his government's strategy in these terms, quote, a complete siege, no electricity, no water, no food, no fuel. The United Nations Independent International Commission of Inquiry found that this was precisely what Israel did. Quote, throughout the siege on Gaza, Israel has weaponized the withholding of life-sustaining necessities, specifically by cutting off supplies of water, food, electricity, fuel, and other essential supplies, including humanitarian assistance. On 6 December 2023, the Secretary General reported to the Security Council, we are facing a severe risk of collapse of the humanitarian system. The situation is fast deteriorating into a catastrophe with potentially irreversible implications for Palestinians as a whole and for peace and security in the region. In response, the Security Council adopted Resolution 2720 on 22 December 2023, which recognized that the civilian population in the Gaza Strip must have access to sufficient quantities of assistance that they need, including enough food, water, sanitation, electricity, telecommunications, and medical services essential for their survival, and that the provision of humanitarian supplies in the Gaza Strip needs to be sufficient to alleviate the massive humanitarian needs of the Palestinian civilian population throughout the Gaza Strip. And the resolution reaffirmed the obligations of the parties to the conflict under international humanitarian law regarding the provision of humanitarian assistance. And it demanded that they allow, facilitate, and enable the immediate, safe, and unhindered delivery of humanitarian assistance at scale directly to the Palestinian civilian population throughout the Gaza Strip. Israel ignored the Security Council's demand, just as it disregarded subsequent Security Council resolutions 2728 and 2735, adopted in 2024, and 5 General Assembly emergency special session resolutions, which called on it again to allow and facilitate urgently needed humanitarian assistance at scale to the Palestinian civilian population in Gaza. In fact, Israel did the opposite of what was demanded to it. It continued to impede the provision of humanitarian goods and services indispensable to the survival of the Palestinian people, and it restricted humanitarian access by United Nations agencies, other states, and international humanitarian organizations. The court needs no reminding that Israel also disregarded its orders on provisional measures in the case brought by South Africa, which were issued on 26 January, 28 March, and 24 May 2024. Israel was required by the March order to take all necessary and effective measures to ensure, without delay, in full cooperation with the United Nations, the unhindered provision at scale by all concerned of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance, including food, water, electricity, fuel, shelter, clothing, hygiene and sanitation requirements, as well as medical supplies and medical care to Palestinians throughout Gaza, including by increasing the capacity and number of land crossing points and maintaining them open for as long as necessary. Israel has ignored these obligations and refused to comply. By May 2024, the court recognized that, quote, the humanitarian situation is now to be characterized as disastrous, as indeed it was. And the situation grew even worse thereafter. On 28 October 2024, the Commissioner General of UNRWA made this report to the General Assembly. The situation in Gaza is beyond the diplomatic vocabulary of the General Assembly. After more than a year of the most intense bombardment of a civilian population since World War II, and the restriction of humanitarian aid far below minimum needs, the lives of Palestinians are shattered. The surviving population lives in the greatest indignity. In the north, the population is trapped, awaiting death by airstrikes or starvation. On 2 December 2024, the Secretary General reported to the Cairo Ministerial Conference, nothing justifies the collective punishment of the Palestinian people. Collective punishment is, of course, prohibited by Article 33 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. Secretary General continued, yet conditions for Palestinians in Gaza are appalling and apocalyptic. Malnutrition is rampant. Famine is imminent. Meanwhile, the health system has collapsed. What we are seeing may well amount to the gravest international crimes. In the face of the gigantic needs, humanitarian aid is outrageously being blocked. This flies in the face of the clear requirements under international humanitarian law to respect and to protect civilians and to ensure their essential needs are met. It defies numerous General Assembly and Security Council resolutions demanding a ceasefire and unhindered humanitarian access. And it ignores the International Court of Justice, which issued binding provisional orders that must be complied with. As appalling and apocalyptic as the situation was in December, it is even worse today. The Secretary General recognized this in a statement on 8 April. More than an entire month has passed without a drop of aid into Gaza. No food, no fuel, no medicine, no commercial supplies. As aid has dried up, the floodgates of horror have reopened. Gaza is a killing field, and civilians are in an endless death loop. The current path is a dead end, totally intolerable in the eyes of international law and history. And the risk of the occupied West Bank transforming into another Gaza makes it even worse. Mr. President, in these circumstances, there can be no doubt that Israel is violating its obligations under international humanitarian law, including its obligations under the Fourth Geneva Convention and customary international law, as reflected in Additional Protocol 1. In its written statement, Israel argues that its defense and security concerns justify its refusal to allow humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian civilian population, no matter how urgently this assistance is needed. This posture is as unlawful as it is inhumane. Under Article 59 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, as pointed out by the distinguished Undersecretary General for Legal Affairs earlier this morning, quote, if the whole or part of the population of an occupied territory is inadequately supplied, the occupying power shall agree to relief schemes on behalf of the said population and shall facilitate them by all the means at its disposal. The ICRC commentary on Article 59 explains, the obligation on the occupying power to accept such relief is unconditional. In all cases where occupied territory is inadequately supplied, the occupying power is bound to accept relief supplies destined for the population. The Convention not only lays down that the occupying power must agree to relief schemes on behalf of the population, but insists that it must facilitate them by all the means at its disposal. The occupation authorities must therefore cooperate wholeheartedly in the rapid and scrupulous execution of these schemes. Article 59 itself further provides, quote, all contracting parties shall permit the free passage of these consignments and shall guarantee their protection. The ICRC commentary explains that these obligations apply to any state that is enforcing a blockade, and it specifies that the consignments, quote, cannot, under any circumstances, be declared war contraband or be seized as such by those enforcing the blockade. Mr. President, the question posed by the General Assembly calls for the court to issue an opinion on Israel's legal obligations, and I quote, to ensure and facilitate the unhindered provision of urgently needed supplies essential to the supply of the Palestinian civilian population, as well as of basic services and humanitarian and development assistance. This question assumes that the relief consignments are humanitarian in nature. As such, international humanitarian law does not permit Israel to deprive the Palestinian civilian population of such assistance for any reason, including what it claims are its defense or security requirements. This is the conclusion reached by the ICRC itself. In relation to the current situation in Gaza, the ICRC has stated, the suspension of assistance now, including the cessation of power to the only water desalinization facility in Gaza, risks plunging Gaza further into an acute humanitarian emergency. Under international humanitarian law, Israel shall ensure that the basic needs of civilians under its control are met. The rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian assistance must also be allowed and facilitated. I now turn to Israel's legal obligations under the rules of international law applied by the Court in its 2024 advisory opinion. I refer specifically to the Court's determinations that Israel has no sovereignty and may not exercise sovereign powers in the occupied Palestinian territory, and that its presence there is unlawful, such that it must be terminated as rapidly as possible. I refer as well to the Court's determination that Israel has an obligation to facilitate and not to impede the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination, including the right to a sovereign and independent state in the occupied Palestinian territory, and that Israel, by its presence in this territory, its annexations and its settlements, among other actions, has been systematically violating that obligation. The Court further determined that third states and the United Nations are legally obligated not to accept the Israeli presence in the OPT as lawful or to contribute to its maintenance, and must work to bring it to an end, and that they have an erga omnes obligation to support the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. These determinations by the Court have at least three inevitable consequences for the present proceedings. First, because its presence in the OPT is unlawful and it lacks sovereign rights or powers within the territory, Israel has no legal authority to impede humanitarian goods and services from entering or circulating within the Gaza Strip or any other part of Palestinian territory. The decision to accept and receive humanitarian assistance, and from whom, is an exercise of sovereignty, which, in the case of the Palestinian territory, belongs exclusively to the Palestinian people, who are represented by the State of Palestine. Accordingly, in addition to its obligations to ensure and facilitate the provision of humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian civilian population under international humanitarian law, Israel bears an obligation under general international law not to override the sovereign will of the Palestinian people, expressed through their legitimate governmental representative, to receive in their own territory such urgently needed assistance and services as they may authorize from the United Nations, third states, and other trusted organizations. Second, Israel's prevention of humanitarian assistance from entering Gaza also violates its obligation, in the Court's words, quote, not to impede the Palestinian people from exercising its right of self-determination. As the Court explained, the right of self-determination includes the right to territorial integrity, the right to be protected against acts aimed at dispersing the population and undermining its integrity as a people, and the right of the people freely to determine its political status and to pursue its economic, social, and cultural development, all of which the Court found were violated by Israel's prolonged occupation of Palestinian territory. By preventing humanitarian assistance from entering Palestinian territory, Israel further violates each of these components of the right of self-determination. In particular, Israel's denial of food, water, and other essentials of life to the Palestinian civilian population inevitably impedes their economic, social, and cultural development. And it is intended, as Israeli officials themselves proclaim, to displace and disperse the Palestinian population, especially in Gaza, but increasingly in the West Bank as well, which undermines their integrity as a people. Mr. President, I see that the clock is approaching 11:30. I have somewhere between 5 and 8 more minutes of my speech remaining. If you allow me to continue, I would be happy to do so. If you prefer to take the coffee break, obviously that's fine with us. We're entirely in your hands.
I think we can have coffee after you finish your remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Israel's prevention of humanitarian assistance also violates the territorial integrity of Palestine, another essential component of self-determination. As shown on this map, in the southwest Gaza borders Egypt. The main border crossing is at Rafah, which is where most humanitarian assistance, before it was blocked by Israel, entered Gaza. Israel enforces its blockade on goods entering here from within Palestinian territory, thus violating its territorial integrity. The situation is similar in the east, where Israeli forces stationed in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, prevent or restrict the entry of humanitarian assistance from Jordan via the King Hussein al-Karama bridge crossing, again, in violation of Palestinian territorial integrity. As the Secretary General observed, the humanitarian situation in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, is also grave due to Israel's prevention or restriction of humanitarian assistance to the millions of Palestinians who live there. While Israel has not announced a formal cutoff of humanitarian assistance to the West Bank, as it has to Gaza, it has imposed major obstacles to the delivery of such assistance, including the arbitrary withdrawal or denial of operating permits for humanitarian organizations. According to the Commissioner General of UNRWA, while a number of international NGOs have already been silenced, there is now a larger concerted effort in Israel to undermine or restrict, through legislative measures, the operations of international organizations and NGOs. In occupied East Jerusalem, the agency is facing increased pressure from the municipality to vacate premises and end service provision. International staff have been effectively expelled from the occupied West Bank due to the lack of valid visas. The vast majority of the states and international organizations participating in these proceedings agree that Israel's shutdown of relief operations and denial of urgently needed humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian civilian population violate its duty not to impede the Palestinian people from exercising their right of self-determination. According to the Netherlands, for example, in a situation of extreme dependence on relief operations, the occupying power's unilateral decision to terminate its agreement and cooperation with a third party responsible for the bulk of the humanitarian assistance directly and severely affects a people as a whole, frustrating its economic, social, and cultural development. This has severe negative consequences on the ability of the people concerned to exercise its right of self-determination. The written statement of the Secretary General explains, quote, "The obligation of Israel to respect the right of self-determination of the Palestinian people has another important aspect: to respect the decision of the Palestinian people on the manner in which the dependence of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, on Israel for the provision of basic goods and services should be reduced. Therefore, in instances where the representative of the Palestinian people decided to receive basic goods and services from United Nations entities in order to fully enjoy its right of self-determination, Israel is bound to respect that decision." The third consequence of the 2024 advisory opinion is that Israel's prevention of humanitarian assistance from other states and the United Nations violates its duty not to prevent them from fulfilling what the court found to be their erga omnes obligations to support and facilitate the exercise of self-determination by the Palestinian people. Many states and international organizations emphasize this point. The African Union, for example, explains that as a member state of the international community, Israel must cooperate with third states to ensure the effective enjoyment by the Palestinian people of their right to self-determination. It must therefore grant all facilities at its disposal for the provisions by third states of the support necessary for the latter to be able to self-determine. Mr. President, I come now to the final part of my presentation, and the briefest, on Israel's legal obligations under parallel rules of international humanitarian law and international criminal law, particularly those which prohibit starvation of the civilian population as a method of warfare. This practice, which Israel, by admission of its senior government officials, deliberately employs against the Palestinian civilian population in Gaza, is unlawful under both Article 54.1 of Additional Protocol 1, which expressly prohibits it, and the Rome Statute, which provides in Article 8.2b that, quote, intentionally using starvation of civilians as a method of warfare by depriving them of objects indispensable to their survival, including willfully impeding relief supplies, is a war crime. In fact, starvation of civilians as a method of warfare has been recognized as a war crime, at least since the judgment of the Nuremberg Tribunal in 1946. 8 decades later, it is Israel that is deliberately starving more than 2 million Palestinian civilians in Gaza to achieve its purported war ends by cutting off all supplies of food, water, and other essentials of life. This has led the International Criminal Court to charge Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Gallant with the war crime of starvation. In allowing the prosecution to proceed, the pretrial chamber of the ICC explained, there are reasonable grounds to believe that both individuals intentionally and knowingly deprived the civilian population in Gaza of objects indispensable to their survival, including food, water, and medicine and medical supplies, as well as fuel and electricity, from at least 8 October 2023 to 20 May 24. The distinguished legal advisor of Mexico, Pablo Arocha Olabonaga, put it eloquently in an article he published last year. Its title is "Starvation is Starvation is Starvation." People in Gaza are being starved to death, and we are all witnessing it, if not complicit in it. But this human tragedy is a deliberate choice. It is the consequence of a political decision. It is both avoidable and reversible. All of us, as diplomats, international lawyers, humanitarians, but most importantly as individuals, have the moral obligation to raise our voices in outcry of this catastrophe and in efforts to stop it. Israeli authorities must ensure complete and unfettered access for humanitarian goods throughout Gaza. Human dignity simply cannot be held hostage to conflict. This must stop. The inhumanity of this Israeli policy is compounded by its unlawful objective to forever extinguish the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination, including a sovereign and independent state in their own territory, as part of the two-state solution that the international community demands. Mr. President, killing and maiming hundreds of thousands and starving and attempting to displace millions of Palestinians out of Palestine amounts to no less than destroying them as a group. In conclusion, the State of Palestine respectfully submits that Israel's unconscionable violations of its legal obligations under international humanitarian law and under the rules of international law set out in the Court's 2024 advisory opinion must be called out by the Court in its forthcoming advisory opinion, and they must be stopped. International law, we contend, requires this. Maintaining the credibility of the rules-based international order demands it. Thank you, Mr. President and members of the Court, for your kind courtesy and patient attention, and I respectfully request that after the coffee break, you call my esteemed colleague, Blinna Negrali, to the podium. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for permitting me the extra time to complete my speech.
I thank Mr. Leichler. Before I give the floor to the next speaker, the Court will observe a coffee break of 15 minutes. The hearing is suspended. Please be seated. The sitting is resumed. I now invite Ms. Blin Nijari to address the court and continue the presentation of Palestine. You have the floor, Madam.
Mr. President, members of the court, it is an honour as ever to appear before you. It is also an immense privilege, though a weighty responsibility, to represent the state of Palestine in such extreme circumstances for the Palestinian people. I will address Israel's relevant obligations as a United Nations member, focusing on its obligations: 1, to cooperate with the United Nations; 2, to ensure the privileges, immunities and protection of UN staff and property; 3, to ensure the fundamental human rights of the Palestinian people; and 4, to abide by UN resolutions and this court's orders. Israel's violations of those obligations are egregious and ongoing. They are also in breach of Israel's obligation of good faith under the Charter, which is the 5th issue I will address and with which I will conclude. I address those legal issues in the context of the almost unimaginable and yet ever-worsening situation in the occupied Palestinian territory, particularly in Gaza. On the 27th of March of this year, the last international staff of the United Nations Relief and Work Agency left Gaza. Given Israel's recently passed anti-UNRWA legislation, no further UNRWA staff is likely to be permitted entry. 3 days earlier, on the 24th of March, the Secretary-General of the United Nations had announced his, I quote, difficult decision to reduce the organization's footprint in Gaza, even as humanitarian needs soar and the United Nations' concern over the protection of civilians intensifies, end quote. His decision, evocative of previous genocides in Rwanda and Bosnia, followed Israel's breach of the ceasefire agreement on the 18th of March 2025 and its resumption of its siege and large-scale assault on Gaza. As had been threatened by the Israeli Defense Minister, Israel Katz, I quote, "The gates of Gaza closed and the gates of hell reopened." Israel killed almost 500 people, including more than 180 children, in the deadliest 24 hours in Gaza since October 2023. One strike on a designated UN compound killed one international UN official and injured seriously 5 others. The Secretary-General's decision to reduce the United Nations footprint in Gaza followed days later. The United Nations itself cannot keep its staff in Gaza safe from Israel because nowhere and no one is safe. The past 18 months have been the deadliest ever in the history of the United Nations. Of over 418 aid workers killed in Gaza, 295 of them were UN staff. Most of them teachers, doctors, nurses, engineers, operational staff were Palestinian. Those Palestinian staff remain in Gaza. Their own footprint is also being reduced each day as they are injured and killed. As stated by Médecins Sans Frontières, Gaza has been turned into a mass grave of Palestinians and those coming to their assistance, end quote. In the words of the Secretary-General, it is a killing field. Since March 2025, Israel has no longer even maintained the pretense of designating so-called humanitarian zones. In the last month alone, it has bombed over 20 times the tents of the displaced in Al-Mawasi, the overcrowded sandy wasteland to which it repeatedly ordered Palestinians to flee, a ground invasion of which is now reportedly imminent. As stated by UNICEF, I quote, "Images of children burning while sheltering in makeshift tents should shake us all to our core." The warnings of United Nations officials could not be clearer, including by the head of office for OCHA in the occupied Palestinian territory, who himself remains in Gaza. I quote variously, "As humanitarian leaders, we are repeating unequivocally to the world, we are being deliberately blocked from saving lives in Gaza, and so civilians are dying. As humanitarians, we need to emphasize that we cannot accept that Palestinians are dehumanized to the point of being somehow unworthy of survival. What is happening here defies decency, it defies humanity, it defies the law." End quote. Before turning to what that law is in terms of Israel's obligations as a member of the United Nations, it's important to recall the reason for the organization's presence and vital role in Palestine. As recently acknowledged by the Israeli Finance Minister Smotrich, I quote, "For 75% of Gaza's population, it's not their homeland. Do you know what their homeland is? Haifa, Tiberias, Accra, Jaffa. This is a refugee population that has been in Gaza since 1948. End quote. Those refugees, their children and grandchildren, have indeed been in Gaza since 1948, and in East Jerusalem, and in the rest of the West Bank, and violently scattered to the four corners of the earth since being forcibly expelled from their homes on the creation of the State of Israel. The mass displacement and dispossessions Palestinians refer to as al-Nakba, the catastrophe. They are the people, alongside those Palestinians previously long and deeply rooted in Gaza, whom Israel is bombing, starving, maiming and killing, and whom it has violently displaced over and over again for 18 long months. In the West Bank, including East Jerusalem also, Israel is subjecting to ongoing and intensifying attack that same refugee population, alongside other Palestinians, including those violently displaced previously since Israel's occupation began in 1967. Israel's ongoing mass displacements, its demolitions of homes, entire refugee camps, and necessary infrastructure, and its ever-escalating killings of Palestinian men, women, and children, risk, in the words of the Secretary-General, transforming the West Bank into another Gaza. Having denied for 77 years the right of return of refugees and the peremptory right of Palestinians to self-determination, in violation of international law and UN resolutions, Israel is now seeking to destroy Palestinians as a group, including by inflicting on them conditions of life calculated to bring about their destruction, by seizing ever more Palestinian territory, and by turning Gaza into an uninhabitable wasteland incapable of sustaining human life. Having willfully destroyed the ability of the Palestinian people to sustain themselves independently, Israel is now intensifying its weaponization of the food and relief assistance on which it has long forced so many Palestinians to rely for their survival. It is also seeking to destroy UNRWA, the very agency mandated by the United Nations to provide them with life-sustaining aid and assistance, including to, I quote, "prevent conditions of starvation and distress among them," end quote, until a just and lasting resolution of their plight, in accordance with international law, including General Assembly Resolution 1943 of 1948. It is against that backdrop that I turn to Israel's breach of its duty to cooperate with the United Nations. Article 2.5 of the Charter stipulates that all members shall give the United Nations every assistance in any action it takes in accordance with the present Charter. This is a broad obligation of cooperation, binding members without restriction as to the nature of the action involved or the identity of the United Nations entity taking it, subject to the action being in accordance with the Charter. This is reflected in state practice, including written statements in these proceedings, and numerous UN resolutions concerning Palestine. Israel now argues before this court that the Article 2.5 obligation should be interpreted as restricted to certain limited actions taken by the Security Council, where the United States repeatedly wields its veto to shield Israel from accountability. But Israel interpreted this obligation very differently when being considered for membership in the United Nations. At a meeting of the committee considering its application in 1949, Israel undertook unqualifiedly to, I quote, cooperate with the organs, plural, of the United Nations with all the means at our disposal in the fulfillment of the part of Resolution 194 concerning refugees, end quote. Israel has also interpreted the obligation broadly when commending other states for acting as, quote, loyal members of this organisation, end quote, in providing every assistance to the UN pursuant to Article 2.5. Israel cannot now credibly assert for itself a different interpretation of the Charter. The Court has itself confirmed the nature of the obligation in its Reparation for Injuries advisory opinion. It emphasised the importance of the duty, noting that, I quote, the effective working of the organisation, the accomplishment of its task, and the independence and effectiveness of the work of its agents require that these undertakings should be strictly observed. Accordingly, as the Secretary-General has underscored, it has been a long-standing position of the Secretariat, I quote, that Member States are required to provide every assistance to United Nations entities to ensure the effective implementation of their mandates. He reaffirmed this just 4 months ago in his letter to the Security Council and General Assembly, underscoring that as a member of the United Nations, Israel is required, quote, to give UNRWA every assistance, end quote, in any action taken in accordance with the Charter. Israel is intentionally and egregiously failing to do so. Secondly, and relatedly, Israel is egregiously breaching its obligations to respect the inviolability of UN premises and the immunity of UN premises, property and assets, pursuant to Charter Article 105 and Israel's obligations under the 1946 Convention on the Privileges and Immunities of the United Nations. Israel is similarly in egregious breach of its obligations to respect the privileges and immunities of UN officials, including salaried Palestinian staff, international staff, and experts on UN missions, including fact-finding missions. Those obligations are unqualified and apply both in times of peace and of armed conflict. They cannot be abrogated by a military occupier, particularly one that is unlawfully present in occupied territory. Given that those obligations bind Israel pursuant to the Charter and the 1946 Convention to which it is a party, they are entirely unaffected by Israel's announced withdrawal from its bilateral agreement with UNRWA. Israel's violations of those obligations in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, include its forcible entry into UN schools, its seizure and often violent shuttering of UN premises, and its failure to protect them from attack by Israeli civilians. They also include Israel's obstruction or prohibition of the movement of Palestinian UN staff and of the access by international UN staff to the occupied Palestinian territory. In Gaza, Israel's violations of those obligations include its obstruction of UN aid, supplies, goods and equipment into and throughout the territory, and its attacks on UN food stores, distribution facilities and humanitarian convoys. Further violations include Israel's use of UN premises as military bases and its violent, lethal attacks on UN schools, shelters and healthcare facilities, which have been a feature of every large-scale military assault on Gaza since at least 2009. Since October 2023 alone, Israel has attacked more than 310 UN facilities in Gaza, many being struck repeatedly. Israel violates the immunities of UN officials, including by killing, injuring, and unlawfully detaining them, and subjecting them to violent interrogation and ill treatment, including severe beatings, waterboarding, deprivation of food and water, and threats of extreme harm to their families. Such violations against UN staff also constitute serious breaches of Israel's obligations under the 1973 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Crimes against Internationally Protected Persons. For 18 months and long previously, Israel has failed to prevent violent attacks on UN officials or to prosecute those responsible. The Israeli attacks on the 23rd of March 2025 on UN personnel and other aid workers in Rafah stands as a stark example. The slide on your screens shows the mangled wreckage of a UN vehicle, crushed by Israeli soldiers and hidden in the sand, buried alongside its murdered driver, a UN employee, and 14 medics and first responders, with their destroyed ambulances and fire truck. They were only recovered 6 days later, an initial joint UN mission to recover the bodies having been abandoned after, I quote, encountering hundreds of civilians fleeing under gunfire. The acting director of OCHA in Gaza described, I quote again, witnessing a woman shot in the back of the head. When a young man tried to retrieve her, he too was shot, end quote. As a video recording has exposed, the Israeli Army's Golani unit, responsible for the attacks on the 23rd of March, was briefed prior to its deployment to Rafah that, I quote, everyone you encounter is an enemy. If you spot a figure, open fire, eliminate, and move on. It was the recording of the Israeli attacks on the 23rd of March, found on the mobile phone of a slain Palestinian Red Crescent paramedic, that compelled Israel's retraction of its initial attempted justification of the killings. That recording of Refat Radwan's final words also reflects the sacrifice made by so many in Gaza who have given their lives for others. After reciting the Muslim prayers of the dying and knowing his mother's heart would be broken by his death, he called out, "Forgive me, Mother, forgive me. I chose this path to help people. Forgive me." As stated by the Director General of the International Committee of the Red Cross, quote, "The situation in Gaza will haunt us for decades because no one will be able to say we weren't aware. All the information is available. The images are there," end quote. They are being streamed from the phones of the living and the dead. All the information is available also of Israel's long-standing violations of the fundamental human rights of Palestinians, which is a third topic to which I now turn. Israel's actions, including those long predating October 2023, are an egregious violation of Articles 55 and 56 of Chapter 9 of the Charter. Through those articles, Israel, quote, "pledged to take joint and separate action in cooperation with the United Nations to promote higher standards of living and universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all," end quote. The obligations to which Chapter 9 gives rise are not optional. As the United States explained in its submissions in the Southwest Africa case, which concerned another situation of occupation of Namibia by apartheid South Africa, I quote, "In accordance with Chapter 9 of the Charter, states have an obligation to cooperate with the United Nations towards the realization of human rights and fundamental freedoms without discrimination for the people of Namibia," end quote. The same applies without discrimination to the people of Palestine. That is because through the Charter, the people of the United Nations, including Israel, have declared themselves, quote, determined to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, and in the equal rights of nations large and small, end quote. One of the foundational purposes of the United Nations is, I quote, to achieve international cooperation in solving international problems of a humanitarian character and in promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all, without distinction, end quote. International law protects and binds all peoples equally. There are no children of a lesser God. Yet for decades, Israel has denied and violated with impunity the fundamental human rights of the Palestinian people, in breach of its obligations under the UN Charter and international human rights law, while in parallel preventing attempts by the UN, other organisations and third states to ensure their fulfilment. It has violated the right of Palestinians to development, causing widespread poverty across the occupied Palestinian territory and forcing large numbers of people into dependence on international assistance. And then it has obstructed that international assistance or destroyed it once provided. It has violated the rights of Palestinians to food, to water, to health, to physical integrity, to education, to property, to shelter, and above all else, their right to life, including through the system of racial discrimination and apartheid it has imposed. The hundreds of thousands of Palestinian men, women and children whom it has imprisoned, many without charge or trial, have been particularly severely impacted. Israel's violations have been extensively documented by UN bodies and by Palestinian and international NGOs, and their breaches recorded by this court in 2 previous advisory opinions. However, even as against that standard, Israel's violations since October 2023 have been unprecedented. The International Criminal Court's arrest warrant for Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Defence Minister Gallant include the crime against humanity of persecution, defined as, I quote, the intentional and severe deprivation of fundamental rights, contrary to international law, by reason of the identity of the group or collectivity. In addition to the war crime of starvation, dealt with in the previous presentation, warrants have also been issued for the crimes against humanity of murder and inhumane acts, involving killing and the infliction of great physical or mental suffering or serious injury, committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack against a civilian population. The ICC pretrial chamber considered, for example, that, I quote, by intentionally limiting or preventing medical supplies and medicine from getting into Gaza, the 2 individuals are responsible for inflicting great suffering by means of inhumane acts on persons in need of treatment. Doctors were forced to operate on wounded persons and carry out amputations, including on children, without anaesthetics, causing these persons extreme pain and suffering, end quote. And almost inconceivably, the situation has deteriorated further since those warrants were issued. As of late 2024, the UN had already assessed that local water and food production in Gaza, crops, olive tree orchards, fishing, cattle and poultry farms had been all but destroyed, as had been essential services, including electricity, water and sewerage, alongside the destruction of bakeries, shops and trade. And now, no fuel, no medicine, no food, no water. Nothing has been permitted by Israel to enter Gaza for 57 days. 3 days ago, on Friday, the UN World Food Programme announced that it had now, I quote, depleted all its food stocks in Gaza. Widespread malnutrition, rampant infectious diseases, alongside untreated conditions and the severe mental impact of Israel's assault on Gaza, together with its systematic destruction of 95% of Gaza's hospitals and maternity clinics, and its killing of so many of Gaza's medical experts, will impact Palestinians for generations. This is not just about Gaza's present, but about its very future. And Gaza's future, its approximately 1 million children, are being impacted particularly severely. Children are literally freezing and starving to death. They include 79 children, including 8 newborn babies, who died during the particularly harsh cold weather of Christmas and New Year gone by. Gaza is now home to the largest cohort of child amputees in the world, the largest orphan crisis in modern history, and a whole generation in danger of suffering from stunting, causing irreparable physical and cognitive impairments. Over 15,600 children have been killed violently. Tens of thousands more of Gaza's children are injured or missing, and many of those surviving are so traumatized that they openly express the wish to die. They, like everyone in Gaza, are in desperate, urgent need of assistance, which Israel continues to block. As recently warned by the heads of 12 international aid agencies, I quote, "Survival itself is now slipping out of reach." Israel's acts are not just murderous and inhumane, they are genocidal, as the UN Commission of Inquiry and others have concluded, and as is the near consensus view across the human rights community. While the determination of Israel's international responsibility for genocide is the subject of other proceedings before this court, the risk to the right of Palestinians to be protected from acts of genocide is at issue in these proceedings. That is because the court is being asked to advise on Israel's obligations in relation to the provision of aid and other services to Gaza in the context of a binding determination by a competent organ of the United Nations, being the court itself, that there exists a real and imminent risk of irreparable prejudice to the right of Palestinians to be protected from acts of genocide, and that Israel must ensure humanitarian aid and basic services in that situation. Despite Israel's objections, there is nothing to prevent the court advising on the obligations flowing from that situation in these proceedings. On the contrary, given that what is an issue is at the very least a situation of a risk of a violation of a peremptory norm of an erga omnes nature, the court could itself risk, I quote, failing in the discharge of its judicial functions if it did not declare that there is an obligation, especially upon members of the United Nations, to bring that situation to an end, end quote, as the court underscored in the South West Africa case. In the context of what UNRWA's Commissioner General has called, I quote, one of the darkest times for our common humanity that we vowed would not happen again, end quote, the court might well consider it particularly important to remind all states again, as it did a year ago in Nicaragua versus Germany, of their international obligations under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, as well as under other binding rules of international law. That brings me to the fourth and penultimate issue, Israel's violations of UN resolutions and the orders of this court. Applying the court's reasoning in South West Africa, there is no doubt that the 4 Security Council resolutions addressing the current situation in Gaza are binding decisions pursuant to Article 25 of the Charter, having regard to their subject matter, their imperative language, and the discussions leading to them. Those discussions include the Secretary-General's exceptional triggering in December 2023 of Article 99 of the Charter, the most powerful tool available to him, permitting him to bring to the Security Council, quote, any matter which, in his opinion, may threaten the maintenance of international peace and security, end quote. Israel's continuing failure to comply with those resolutions, with unanimous Resolution 2417, which condemns the unlawful denial of humanitarian access to civilian populations, and with dozens of other Security Council resolutions since its admission to the United Nations, constitute repeated violations of Charter Article 25, reflecting a fundamental rejection of the Security Council's authority. Israel has similarly defied numerous General Assembly resolutions, including those calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, setting out the modalities for the implementation of this Court's 2024 advisory opinion, and, I quote, strongly deploring the continued and total disregard and breaches by the Government of Israel of its obligations under the Charter. End quote. Israel continues to defy Resolution 194 concerning the right of return of Palestinian refugees, with which it unequivocally undertook to comply on being admitted to UN membership, and Resolution ES 1024, demanding that Palestinians displaced during Israel's occupation be allowed to return home, as stipulated by this Court in its 2024 opinion. Israel has also repeatedly violated Charter Article 94(1) by failing to comply with this Court's binding orders in South Africa versus Israel. Israel's Prime Minister has rejected the Court's authority, asserting that, I quote, nobody will stop us, not The Hague, not the axis of evil, and not anybody else. Just 12 days ago, its Defence Minister declared, in defiance of this Court's orders, that, I quote, Israel's policy is clear, and no humanitarian aid is about to enter Gaza. In violation of the Court's order to maintain open land crossing points, in particular the Rafah crossing, previously described by the UN High Commissioner as, quote, the symbolic lifeline for 2.3 million people in Gaza, Israel has closed all crossings, and it has turned Rafah itself, once a refuge for almost 1.5 million displaced Palestinians, into a post-apocalyptic wasteland. The slide on your screens, reflective of the general tenor of Israeli media since at least October 2023, shows Rafah devastated, with the caption, "The annihilation of Rafah is complete," alongside an Israeli flag and a flexed bicep. Plans are reportedly underway for Israel to annex 75 square kilometres of Rafah, 1/5 of Gaza, to Israel's so-called buffer zone, permanently. This, together with Israel's continuing maritime blockade, cuts Gaza and its people off from direct aid and assistance and from the rest of the world. In further violation of the Court's orders, Israel continues to block UN-mandated investigatory bodies from Gaza, while destroying and burying evidence of its crimes. Despite the extraordinary efforts of Palestinian journalists, who are themselves repeatedly targeted and killed, so much remains undocumented. As stated by UNRWA's Commissioner General, I quote, I shudder to think of what will still be revealed about the horrors that have taken place in this narrow strip of land. Simultaneously, Israel obstructs external investigations. It does so while its officials denounce the UN Commission of Inquiry and the UN Human Rights Council itself as, quote, a propaganda mouthpiece for terrorist organisations and anti-Semitic Israel haters engaged in blood libels, and calls for the Council to be, quote, removed from this earth. And so to my final submission concerning the principle of good faith, one of the United Nations bedrock principles set out in Article 2.2 of the Charter. It provides, all members, in order to ensure to all of them the rights and benefits resulting from membership, shall fulfil in good faith the obligations assumed by them in accordance with the present Charter. The obligation, reaffirmed in the Declaration on Friendly Relations, was described by the Court in the nuclear test case as, quote, one of the basic principles governing the creation and performance of legal obligations, whatever their source, end quote. It reflects not only the maxim of pacta sunt servanda, but also that of qui habet commode, fere debet honora. Whomever receives the advantages must also bear the responsibilities. Israel is failing to fulfill its charter responsibilities in good faith. Its violations of the fundamental rights of the Palestinian people, its attacks on the United Nations and on UN officials' property and premises, its deliberate obstruction of the organisation's work, and its attempt to destroy an entire UN subsidiary organ are unprecedented in the history of the organisation. They evidence a fundamental repudiation by Israel of its charter obligations, owed both to the organisation and to all UN members, and of the international rule of law. They are antithetical to the actions of a peace-loving state. Israel's very submissions to this court violate its obligations to cooperate with the UN in good faith, advancing allegations for which Israel has persistently failed to provide credible evidence. This is notwithstanding the Secretary-General's call on Israel, quote, to refrain from such misrepresentations, end quote, given how very damaging they are to the United Nations. But for Israeli officials, damage to the United Nations appears to be the point. Their attacks are not limited to UNRWA or indeed the UN Human Rights Council. Israel has declared the Secretary-General of the United Nations himself persona non grata in Israel, accusing him of being, quote, an official Hamas spokesperson engaged in anti-Semitic and anti-Israel conduct. Israeli officials demand his resignation, labelling his triggering of Charter Article 99 and his calls for a ceasefire in Gaza, quote, a danger to world peace. Senior Israeli officials level similar accusations at the United Nations itself as an organisation, denouncing it as, quote, a swamp of anti-Semitic bile, an accomplice to terrorists, and a stain on humanity. Israeli officials have even sought to discredit this court, calling it, quote, an anti-Semitic court comprising judges from Muslim dictatorships, which has been manipulated and weaponized in the persecution of the Jewish people. As stated by UNRWA's Commissioner General, I quote, the international order is crumbling in a repetition of the horrors that led to the establishment of the United Nations and in violation of commitments to prevent their recurrence. The attacks on UNRWA are an integral part of this disintegration, end quote. Not stopping at UNRWA, the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations itself has demanded that the entire UN and, quote, its corrupt courts, the ICC and the ICJ, must be defunded, end quote. In addition to seeking to destroy the protective application of international law to the Palestinian people, Israel appears set on destroying the very international framework created to ensure compliance with international law and accountability for its breach, with profound consequences that reverberate far beyond Palestine and Palestinians. If these venerable institutions are to survive, and if, in the words of the UN Relief Chief, quote, the basic principles of law still count, the international community must act while it can to uphold them, end quote. Mr. President, members of the Court, the international community is so acting in seeking the Court's advice on these matters, having regard to the Court's prior vital, unwavering reaffirmation of international law in its 2024 advisory opinion. Mindful of the former Secretary-General's description of the United Nations as, quote, the hope and home of all humankind, with the Charter at its compass, end quote, the State of Palestine respectfully calls on this Court to provide this further advisory opinion urgently to reset that compass in the continuing desperate hope that international law might finally prevail. Monsieur le Président, Mesdames et Messieurs les juges,
Mr. President, members of the Court, I thank you for your kind attention and I ask you to now call Professor Immunities.
I thank Ms. Nijali. I now give the floor to Mr. Adri Inisais. You have the floor, sir.
Members of the court, it is an honor to appear before you today on behalf of the State of Palestine and the Palestinian people. I have been given the task of addressing the issue of UNRWA, and to that end, I should like to make 3 points. First, for context, I will discuss the unique historical and operational importance of UNRWA. Second, I will demonstrate both why and how Israel has set upon to destroy the agency. And third, I will discuss Israel's legal obligations towards UNRWA, which this court is urgently requested to affirm by the vast majority of states and international organizations in these proceedings. First, the context. UNRWA's mandate is an essential element of what the court has twice recognized as the permanent responsibility of the United Nations for the question of Palestine. This responsibility originates in the unsuccessful attempt by the General Assembly to partition Palestine, and without the consent of the Palestinian people, in 1947, and the ensuing 1948 Nakba, during which between 750,000 and 900,000 Palestinians were forcibly exiled from that part of Palestine that became Israel. In Resolution 302 of 8 December 1949, the General Assembly recognized that continued assistance for the relief of the Palestine refugees is necessary to prevent conditions of starvation and distress among them and to further conditions of peace and stability. UNRWA was created to provide direct relief and works programs to the refugees until their plight was resolved in accordance with international law. The Assembly therefore determined that UNRWA's mandate was to be discharged without prejudice to the right of the Palestine refugees to return to restitution and to compensation in accordance with Resolution 194 of 11 December 1948. But these rights, Mr. President, have never been allowed to be realized. Indeed, with the Israeli occupation of the rest of Palestine in 1967, another 250,000 to 300,000 Palestinians were forcibly exiled and became dependent on UNRWA. And the conditions of starvation and distress have not only continued over the years to varying degrees, but as the court knows only too well, since October 2023, they have gathered a pace never before seen. In essence, it is because of Israel's prolonged violation of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people to return to self-determination, indeed to freedom, that the need for UNRWA is as pressing today, if not more so, than it was in 1949. The General Assembly agrees with this assessment. It has continuously renewed UNRWA's mandate with overwhelming support, insisting that until the Palestine refugees realize their rights under international law, UNRWA must remain in place. Operationally, UNRWA provides education, health, relief and social services, and during emergencies, humanitarian aid. And generations of Palestinians have been sustained by these quasi-governmental services in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and the occupied Palestinian territory. Uniquely, UNRWA's services are directly delivered by thousands of personnel, the vast majority of whom are themselves registered Palestine refugees with the agency. In the occupied Palestinian territory, the number of these staff literally dwarf that of other UN personnel by orders of magnitude, possessing decades of experience, expertise, and all-important community trust. And for these reasons, the necessity of UNRWA is indisputable. The sheer scope of continued Israeli violations of Israeli rights, or rather of Palestinian rights, including the right to the unhindered provision of urgently needed humanitarian supplies essential for their survival, as well as the right for basic services, humanitarian and developmental assistance in support of their right to self-determination, renders UNRWA absolutely vital. As recognized by the General Assembly in the referral resolution, no organization can replace or substitute the agency's capacity or mandate. Mr. President, the Secretary General agrees. He states that UNRWA is indispensable in delivering essential services to Palestinians, and that UNRWA is the backbone of the United Nations humanitarian relief operations in Gaza. This conclusion is shared by other UN and humanitarian agencies operating in Palestine who rely on UNRWA's unmatched operational infrastructure, partnership, and support. It is also shared by nearly all participants in these proceedings, including China, which has referred to UNRWA as indispensable and irreplaceable, both Mexico and Luxembourg, which have each called UNRWA unique and irreplaceable, and Algeria, which has labeled UNRWA the cornerstone of the humanitarian assistance in occupied Palestinian territory. In his written statement, the Secretary General provided incontrovertible empirical evidence in support of this position. I quote, "Since October 2023, UNRWA has supported nearly 2.3 million affected individuals in Gaza with food, health care, and shelter. It has distributed food aid to around 1.9 million people and provided more than 60% of primary health care services in Gaza. Furthermore, UNRWA has sheltered hundreds of thousands of internally displaced persons in more than 100 schools and continues to deliver psychosocial support and primary health consultations. Between 7 October 2023 and 19 January 2025, UNRWA facilitated over 7.3 million medical consultations across Gaza. In the occupied Palestinian territory as a whole, the Secretary General reports further that UNRWA operates almost 400 schools, providing education to more than 350,000 students, and over 65 primary health clinics and 1 hospital, facilitating over 5 million health consultations annually. It does this, all of this, with 17,000 personnel. In sum, the evidentiary record shows that UNRWA is not just any humanitarian aid organization. It is organically linked to the unique role played by the United Nations in the question of Palestine since 1947, in particular the plight of the Palestine refugees. It is critical to the economic, social, and cultural development of the Palestinian people, and hence their ability to exercise their right of self-determination. And since October 2023, it has been essential to their very survival as a group, especially in Gaza. Mr. President, members of the Court, I now turn to the question of why Israel wants to prevent UNRWA from exercising its mandate. Based on the evidentiary record, Israel's reasons appear to be twofold, one short-term, the other long-term, both indeed inconsistent with its obligations under international law. At the very least, in the short term, Israel is pursuing the erasure of the Palestinian people in Gaza and ultimately the rest of the occupied Palestinian territory, including through forcible transfer. In Gaza, where almost 80% of the population are already registered refugees connected to the events of 1948, almost the whole of the population, some 1.9 million people, has been forcibly transferred multiple times through Israel's indiscriminate bombardment and starvation campaign. Nor has Israel made a secret of its actions in this regard. Quite the contrary, following multiple calls by government ministers over the course of 2024 to depopulate Gaza and resettle it with Israelis, on 28 January 2025, Israeli military Chief of Staff Herzi Halevi announced a decision to prevent displaced Palestinians from returning. In his words, and I quote, "Gazans will be able to exit the Rafah crossing for Egypt, but only in a one-way direction, and they will not be able to return to Gaza." On 5 February 2025, the Israeli Minister of Defense, Israel Katz, ordered the preparation arrangements for what he euphemistically called the voluntary departure of Palestinians. On 19 March 2025, Minister Katz's previously noted final warning to the citizens of Gaza included the following exhortation, and I quote, "Return the hostages and expel Hamas, and other options will be presented to you, including relocation to other places in the world for those who wish. The alternative is utter destruction and devastation, end quote. In the West Bank, in the past 4 months alone, over 40,000 Palestine refugees have been yet again forcibly transferred through the destruction of 4 refugee camps by Israel, aided by armed gangs of Israeli settlers who operate alongside Israeli occupation forces. Palestinian West Bankers are literally being forcibly displaced every day. Mr. President, the writing is on the wall. With these brazen suggestions that the departure of Palestinians would be voluntary, Israel is not merely insulting the world's intelligence, it's just simply assuming the world has none. After killing or injuring close to 170,000 Palestinians, after turning Gaza into a moonscape of dust and rubble, with over 70,000 tons of bombs, amounting to more than what was dropped on Dresden, Hamburg, and London combined during World War II, after destroying or damaging over 92% of civilian housing, 88% of schools, 84% of health facilities, 95% of water and sanitation systems, and 92% of roads, use of this Orwellian language by Minister Katz must be seen for what it is: an open call to expel as many surviving Palestinians as possible. And as promised by Minister Katz, he's already announced the establishment of an Israeli directorate to oversee the whole thing. Mr. President, my point here is this: elimination of UNRWA is essential to the success of Israel's dreaded plans. Given the scope of UNRWA's capabilities in providing emergency relief, stability and resilience to the Palestinian population in ways that no other organization can operationally do, it is painfully obvious why Israel insists on eliminating the agency. Quite simply, UNRWA is the last hope that the Palestinian people, particularly in the Gaza Strip, have of surviving Israel's genocide against them. More broadly, Israel's long-term purpose behind destroying UNRWA rests in its complete denial of the existence of the Palestinian people, and in particular the status, rights, and claims of millions of Palestine refugees to return, to restitution, and to compensation. But you needn't take my word for it. The Prime Minister of Israel has openly admitted as much on multiple occasions, including, it must be stressed, years before 7 October 2023. For instance, on 11 June 2017, Prime Minister Netanyahu proclaimed, and I quote, "I regret that UNRWA, to a large degree by its very existence, perpetuates and does not solve the Palestinian refugee problem. Therefore, the time has come to disband UNRWA," end quote. Similarly, on 7 January 2018, Mr. Netanyahu said, quote, "UNRWA is an organization that perpetuates the Palestinian refugee problem. It also perpetuates the narrative of the right of return, as it were, in order to eliminate the state of Israel. Therefore, UNRWA needs to pass from the world," end quote. Of course, as members of the court will no doubt be aware, Palestine refugee rights are not legally contingent on UNRWA's existence. Nevertheless, according to Israel's strained logic, it is UNRWA, not Israel itself, that is to blame for the continued exile and deprivations of the Palestine refugees. To avoid having to answer for this, therefore, Israel simply wants to do away with the agency. Mr. President, members of the court, I now turn to the issue of how Israel has pursued its objective of destroying UNRWA. In this respect, Israel's approach has been threefold. First, Israel has systematically attacked UNRWA personnel and property. Only since October 2023, almost 300 UNRWA personnel have been killed by Israel in the Gaza Strip alone, with hundreds more wounded, many for life. Numerous others have been abducted from UNRWA premises and tortured, including to coerce confessions implicating themselves or other agency officials in the events of 7 October. In Gaza, Israel has damaged or destroyed over 310 UNRWA premises since October 2023. These include schools and healthcare facilities, many converted into shelters in which thousands of Palestinian civilians have been killed or injured. In the West Bank, Israel has repeatedly violated its obligations to protect UNRWA premises and property, including UNRWA headquarters in East Jerusalem, which has been subjected to arson attacks by Israeli settlers and is now earmarked for Israeli settlement, having been shuttered by Israel in January. Scores of other UNRWA facilities have been attacked, including forcible entry and takeover. For example, on 18 February 2025, Israeli troops forcibly commandeered the UNRWA Kalandia Training Center, home to 350 students. Likewise, only on April 8th, Israel ordered the closure of 6 UNRWA schools in East Jerusalem, affecting 800 children. Mr. President, the second element of Israel's plan to destroy UNRWA is its campaign to undermine the agency's vital sources of funding. On 26 January 2024, the same day this court issued its first provisional measures order in the South Africa matter, after determining that famine was around the corner in Gaza, Israel urged UNRWA's donors to defund the agency, alleging involvement of UNRWA staff in the attack of 7 October. The resulting funding pause by 18 states added massive pressure on agency operations at a time when millions of beleaguered Palestinians needed UNRWA the most. Israel has repeatedly claimed, and without substantiation, including in its written statement in these proceedings, that upwards of approximately 12% of UNRWA employees in Gaza are members of what it calls terrorist groups. But as the court is well aware, unsupported allegations do not a fact make, no matter how loudly shouted or oft repeated. The fact is that UNRWA has always responded to Israel's allegations in substance, in good faith, and in a timely manner. As the Secretary General reported on 8 January 2025, UNRWA has responded to every allegation that has been raised by the government of Israel against personnel of UNRWA regarding possible political activity that may be against the interest of the United Nations or connections to acts of terror, based on its policy of zero tolerance for activities of this nature. This is demonstrated by the actions taken by UNRWA following allegations that its personnel may have been involved in the attacks of 7 October 2023. Upon receiving the allegations, immediate administrative steps were taken. I immediately referred the allegations to the Office of Internal Oversight Services for investigation under the organization's regulatory framework. Such actions were consistent with the history of UNRWA engagement with the government of Israel, whereby it has been responsive to allegations raised by the government of wrongdoing by UNRWA personnel, end quote. This, of course, is in addition to the finding of the independent review group on UNRWA commissioned by the Secretary General in February 2024, that UNRWA possesses a more developed approach to neutrality than other similar UN or NGO entities. Following UNRWA's commitment to implement the recommendations of the review group, nearly all states that paused their funding have since resumed it. Mr. President, the third element of Israel's campaign to destroy UNRWA has been the passage of 2 anti-UNRWA laws in October 2024. They have been discussed earlier, so I'll quickly skirt over those. This legislation has had grave implications for UNRWA operations across the occupied Palestinian territory, including in East Jerusalem, over which Israel has unlawfully asserted its sovereignty, as was affirmed just this past summer. Israel's anti-UNRWA legislation, together with its broader attacks against UNRWA, have been roundly rejected by the Security Council, which has spoken with one resolute voice. And I quote, "The members of the Security Council strongly warned against any attempts to dismantle or diminish UNRWA's operations and mandate, recognizing that any interruption or suspension of its work would have severe humanitarian consequences for millions of Palestinian refugees who depend on the agency's services, and also implications for the region." Forgive me, I see the, right, there we are. The members of the Security Council expressed their grave concern over legislation adopted by the Israeli Knesset, and in this regard they urged the Israeli government to abide by its international legal obligations, respect the privileges and immunities of UNRWA, and live up to its responsibility to allow and facilitate full, rapid, and safe and unhindered humanitarian assistance in all of its forms into and throughout the entire Gaza Strip, including the provision of sorely needed basic services to the civilian population. I will now turn to my third and final point, namely, what are Israel's legal obligations in respect of UNRWA? Now, given what you've heard from my colleagues this morning, I can be brief in this respect. First, as part of its obligation to respect the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination, Israel is required to facilitate and expand, not ban, disrupt, or attack UNRWA operations in the occupied Palestinian territory. In the referral resolution, the General Assembly specifically called upon Israel to uphold and comply with its obligations, not to impede the Palestinian people from exercising their right to self-determination, including by rescinding any measures that obstruct the provision of basic services and humanitarian and development assistance to the Palestinian people. This plainly includes the services delivered by UNRWA, which is present in the occupied Palestinian territory, it is important to recall, not only at the direction of the General Assembly, but also at the invitation of the State of Palestine and the Palestinian people. Second, all of the international humanitarian law obligations of Israel covered by Mr. Reichler apply with equal force in respect of UNRWA operations in the occupied Palestinian territory. In particular, Article 59 of the Fourth Geneva Convention requires that the occupying power shall agree and facilitate relief schemes if the whole or part of the population of the occupied territory is inadequately supplied. Now, Israel's flagrant breach of this unconditional rule is aggravated by the fact that it is Israel itself who is responsible for the need for relief schemes in the first place. This rule must also be read in conjunction with the binding provisional measures order of the Court of 28 March last year, requiring Israel to, quote, ensure without delay, in full cooperation with the United Nations, the unhindered provision at scale of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance throughout Gaza. Mr. President, I see we're coming up on the break. All I need is another 2 minutes, maybe 3, and I beg your thank you very much.
You can go ahead.
Given UNRWA's unmatched ability to provide relief schemes and to do so at scale to the Palestinian population, there can be no doubt that Israel is obligated to facilitate and expand the agency's vital work, rather than attack and sabotage it. Third, the obligation of Israel as a member of the United Nations, covered by Ms. Nagrali, all apply to its relations with UNRWA. Israel's abrogation of its bilateral agreement with UNRWA does not release it from these broader commitments. Israel remains under an obligation to cooperate in good faith with UNRWA, which requires it to give the agency every assistance in any action taken in accordance with the Charter, and as has been affirmed by the Secretary General. Israel must also ensure and respect the agency's privileges and immunities, which it enjoys as a subsidiary organ of the United Nations, including in respect of its premises, property, assets, and officials. And of course, Israel is also required to ensure the safety of UNRWA personnel. Mr. President, members of the Court, as I close my presentation, I should like to recall the sobering plea made by the Commissioner General of UNRWA in a letter to the President of the General Assembly dated 28 October 2024. He stated, and I quote, "Today I must inform you that the agency is under such physical, political, and operational attack unprecedented in United Nations history, that implementation of its mandate may become impossible without the decisive intervention by the General Assembly. The consequences for Palestinians, for Israel, and for the region will be grave," end quote. Mr. President, the General Assembly has answered the Commissioner General's appeal by placing the question of UNRWA's very future, and with it the rights, status, and existence of the Palestinian people, including millions of Palestine refugees, before you. No less than that is what is at stake in these proceedings. Mr. President, members of the court, this concludes my presentation, and I should like to thank you for your time and careful attention. This also concludes our presentation for this morning. Professor Pillay will continue when we reconvene this afternoon. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Mzais. This concludes this morning's sitting. The oral proceedings will resume this afternoon at 3 p.m., which Palestine will complete its presentation, when the Palestine will complete its presentation, and will be followed by Egypt and Malaysia. The sitting is closed.